Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take those long articles and research papers you've been meaning to read and break them down into bite-sized pieces.
Exactly, because who has time to actually read all that stuff these days?
Seriously, right? And today's Deep Dive is especially fascinating. You know how we're always talking about how to learn better and collaborate more effectively?
Yeah.
Well, you sent us this preprint. Looks like it's from the Cross-Cultural Business Conference in 2025 that digs deep into a university course that's all about those exact things.
Oh, cool. What's it called?
It's called Initiating a Study Program, Co-Creative Learning Through Cross-Cultural Engagement. A mouthful, I know. But it's from the University of Applied Sciences, Upper Austria, and I think there's a lot we can unpack here that's relevant to all of us, not just students.
I'm intrigued already. What kind of sources are we dealing with here?
So it's not just one thing. They've given us this conceptual paper that kind of lays out the overall framework of this lecture, explains the theory behind it, and then they've sprinkled in some real-world examples from the course itself to show how it all plays out.
So we get the theory and the practice all in one place. Nice.
Yeah, exactly. And you know me, I'm always drawn to the stuff that's a little bit unconventional. And one thing that jumped out at me right away was that this course, Social Interaction, used to be called Team Building.
Interesting. What prompted the name change?
Well, it sounds like they really wanted to emphasize that it's not just about, those typical team building exercises you might think of. This is about going deeper, having actual experiences, and then taking the time to really reflect on what happened, not just skimming the surface.
So more than just trust falls and icebreakers. I like it.
Right. All right, so let's dive into the specifics. First off, this isn't your typical boring lecture hall setup, is it? What makes this social interaction lecture so unique?
Yeah, it's really interesting how they've designed this. So social interaction is actually a core part of a larger social skills module for first-year bachelor students. We're talking about 100 hours of work for 4 ECTS credits. That's a pretty substantial commitment, which tells you how seriously they take it.
Wow. Yeah, that's a big chunk of their time and effort. And it sounds like they have a pretty diverse group leading this thing, too. 4 lecturers, each with a different role to play.
That's right. They describe themselves as coaches, authorities, experts, and even laymen, all working together as a team.
That's cool, like a multifaceted approach to teaching. The paper actually has a figure showing how this core team fits within the larger university structure, which is helpful to visualize.
Yeah, I saw that. Makes you realize how much planning and coordination goes into making something like this work.
Totally. So what's the rationale behind having this kind of, multi-perspective leadership?
Well, it seems like they have several goals in mind. First, it's a flagship course for the program, so they really want it to be a defining experience for these first-year students.
Makes sense. Set the tone right from the start.
Yeah. Second, they're really emphasizing collaboration, not just among the students, but between the students and the lecturers. And then third, they're intentionally pulling from different academic disciplines: sales, marketing, CSR, project management. It's all intertwined.
So they're throwing them right into the deep end, huh? Multidisciplinary, collaborative. That's a lot to juggle.
Right.
What are some of the core assumptions that are driving this whole thing? What do they believe about how people learn best?
There are a few that really stand out. One is this idea that culture is embodied in individuals.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Basically, they're saying that real, deep intercultural understanding comes from actually experiencing things together and then reflecting on those experiences. It's about more than just reading about different cultures in a textbook.
I get it. It's like you can read all you want about, say, Japanese business etiquette, but until you're actually in a meeting in Japan navigating those unspoken rules, you don't really get it.
Exactly. And building on that, they also believe that sometimes to really connect, you have to be willing to violate unconscious norms.
Ooh, that's interesting. So it's not about being rude, but about pushing those boundaries a bit.
Yeah, being honest about your own limits and what you're comfortable with, even if it feels a little awkward at first. They argue that that kind of tactful honesty can lead to more genuine connections than just being politely superficial.
I could see how that would create some really dynamic learning moments, for sure.
Yeah.
And the paper also mentions Ashby's law of requisite variety. Does that tie into this somehow?
Yeah, it does. Basically, it's this idea that if you want to teach someone how to handle complex situations in the real world, the learning environment itself has to be complex. You can't just simplify everything down to bullet points and expect them to be prepared for the messiness of reality.
So the teaching needs to match the complexity of the learning outcomes. Makes sense. Which brings us to this concept of co-creative teaching and learning. What does that actually look like in practice?
Well, it means that the lecturers aren't just these all-knowing experts delivering information. They're learning alongside the students, and they're comfortable with not always having all the answers.
That's pretty different from the traditional model of, the professor standing at the lectern.
Right. It's about creating a space where everyone feels empowered to explore and discover things together. There's this great quote from the paper, "Uncertainty is a condition of learning."
I love that. Embracing the unknown. Okay, so we've got this complex collaborative environment, and the lecturers are learning right alongside the students. What about the history of the course itself? The paper mentions that it's been around for a while.
Yeah, it has some pretty deep roots. It actually started back in 2007 as this team building course, and it was the brainchild of the former program director and an external lecturer. They had a long-standing relationship with this charity client, Ella, who's been a key part of the course ever since.
Oh, interesting. So
Yeah.
the focus on real-world application has been there from the beginning.
It seems so. And apparently those early years were very much driven by these strong personal connections, which sometimes led to a more organic, though occasionally chaotic, atmosphere.
So a lot of personality driving the whole thing.
Exactly. But then both of those original founders, the program director and the external lecturer, passed away, which obviously marked a significant turning point. The current core team is relatively new. Oscar, the current program director, came on board in September 2022, and then Regina, Ida, and Anna joined in 2024.
So a period of transition and rebuilding. The paper has another figure here that maps out how the current team fits into the program's overall organizational structure, which I think is really helpful.
Yeah, it gives you a clear sense of who's responsible for what. So how does this new team approach managing the course, especially with all the changes they've gone through?
Right, because the paper mentions their management style.
Yeah, they describe it as moderately hierarchical. They actually reference a specific model where the superior, in this case Oscar, makes the final decisions, but only after consulting with the whole team.
Okay, so a balance of leadership and shared decision-making.
Exactly. And they point out that even though it might take a bit more time, this approach is really beneficial because it means everyone has a chance to weigh in and feel like they have ownership over the final decisions.
Which makes sense, especially in this kind of environment where you're trying to model collaboration for the students.
Right. And the paper acknowledges that this isn't always easy. They say navigating this balance between being hierarchical when necessary and being genuinely open to discussion and negotiation is a learning process for everyone involved, including the lecturers.
Yeah, it sounds like they're walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got the stage set, so to speak. Now let's talk about how the actual learning happens. Their approach is all about learning by doing and reflecting.
Right. That's the core of it. It's based on this idea of experiential learning. So the students are actively engaging in activities, and then they take time to reflect on those experiences in a structured way.
And it's not just about what happened, but also about analyzing the roles people played, the organizational structures at play, and even their own personal reactions and concerns.
Exactly. They specifically reference the work of Donald Schoen, an educational theorist who really emphasized this reflective practice.
Okay, so hands-on experience plus deep reflection. And it sounds like the lecturers themselves have to be pretty aware of their own roles and how those roles might shift depending on the situation.
Oh, absolutely. The paper has a table that lays out all these different roles that the lecturers might take on and suggests the best leadership or follower style for each situation.
So they're constantly adapting their approach based on the context. Can you give me a specific example of how that plays out?
Sure. So Anna, who's the overall coordinator of the course, naturally takes a more leading role in the day-to-day operations of the lecture. But within the broader study program, she's following Oscar's lead as the program director. So it's all very dynamic. It depends on what hat they're wearing, so to speak.
Right, so their influence and authority can change depending on the situation. That makes sense. And the goal is to equip the students to be able to handle both those more directive leadership styles and the more collaborative approaches.
Exactly. They want them to be comfortable navigating both ends of that spectrum.
Yeah.
And a big part of that is experiencing it firsthand.
Which leads us to the heart of the course, the charity project. Tell me more about this central element.
So the main task for the students is to develop and execute a real charity project to raise funds for a client. And that client, who we mentioned earlier, is Ella. This has been a consistent element of the course for years, so it's a pretty well-established system.
Okay, and what does this project actually involve? The paper mentions setting up a punch stand.
Yeah, that's the main event. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, they set up a stand in a busy shopping street in Vienna, and they offer punch and some small goods for donations. They actually use an existing punch stand that's operated by another charity during that period, so they have to work within those existing parameters.
Ah, so a real-world constraint right from the start. That's cool. What kind of challenges do the students face in pulling this off, especially since they're just starting out?
Oh, there are a ton of challenges. They have to figure out how to organize themselves within the project team structure that's given to them. They have to develop all the content for the project, the marketing materials, what they're going to offer at the stand, and figure out how they're going to communicate effectively as a team.
So they're essentially learning project management, marketing, and sales all at the same time, all while actually doing it.
Exactly. And it's not just the practical stuff. They have to learn how to negotiate with each other, with Ella as the client, and potentially even with the people running the punch stand itself. They have to come up with a detailed plan for the actual event days, who's doing what when.
Yeah.
And the big thing is they have to constantly remind themselves that this isn't just about raising money, it's a learning experience. It's about all those social interactions, the marketing, the sales, the project management, all of it.
Wow, that's a lot to handle. It's like drinking from a fire hose. What about the core team, the lecturers? What challenges do they face in managing this whole thing?
They have their own set of hurdles to clear. They have to provide that initial framework and guidance for the student teams, but then they have to be careful not to step in too much and let the students make their own decisions. They're like coaches more than anything else.
I see. Guiding from the sidelines.
Right. And they also have to facilitate communication, not just within the student teams, but between the students and themselves and with Ella, the client. It's a lot of juggling, and they have to stay aware of their own roles, which can shift depending on the situation. Are they being the coach, the authority figure, the expert? And then a crucial part of their role is to constantly remind the students that this lecture has 3 distinct layers, which the paper actually illustrates with a diagram.
Okay, let's unpack those layers. How does this 3-layer concept work?
So the first layer is the actual lectures themselves. These are more traditional, with short presentations, discussions, set meeting times, mandatory attendance. That's where they lay the groundwork for the theory and the concepts.
Okay, that makes sense. Layer 2 is the charity project itself, right?
Exactly. That's the experimental framework where the students are really encouraged to take the initiative and learn by doing. The lecturers mainly act as coaches in this layer, offering guidance but intentionally stepping back to give the students space to figure things out. And then the third layer, which is interwoven throughout everything, is reflection. This isn't a separate activity. It's something that should be happening constantly during team meetings, after key milestones, and culminating in a final group reflection at the end.
They call that final reflection the performance evaluation, right?
Yep. And the paper also has a table showing how the lecturers divide up their workload across these different activities, which I thought was interesting. Shows how much goes into it behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's clearly a very intentional and carefully designed system. All right, so we've got structured learning, real-world experience, and ongoing reflection. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the scientific perspective that underpins this whole approach. They draw on ideas from intervention science and embodied cognition. Can you explain what those are all about?
Sure. So intervention science is basically about actively trying to change the system you're studying. In this case, they're looking at the whole teaching and learning process as a system and thinking about how to intervene in a way that promotes the kind of learning they're aiming for.
Okay, so it's not just about observing, it's about actively shaping the process.
Right. And they emphasize that teaching and learning aren't separate things. It's all one interconnected process, that co-creative element again.
I see. And where does embodied cognition fit in?
Well, embodied cognition is this idea that our physical experiences and how we interact with the world actually shape our thinking.
Interesting. So our bodies aren't just vessels for our minds. They actually influence how we think.
Exactly. And in the context of communication, this means we all have these unconscious habits and routines and culturally influenced behaviors that affect how we communicate and how we interpret other people's communication.
So our understanding of the world is shaped by our physical experiences. And that, in turn, influences how we communicate.
Yep. The paper uses this great analogy of a visual illusion. You know those images where you can see 2 different things depending on how you look at it?
Oh, yeah, like that famous one with the old woman and the young woman.
That's the one. So they're saying that just like people can look at the same image and see something totally different, our ingrained ways of thinking and acting can lead to miscommunication and misunderstandings. we might not even realize that other valid perspectives exist because we're so stuck in our own way of seeing things.
And this is probably even more pronounced when people are in new situations and interacting with people they don't know well, which is exactly the case with these first-year students.
Precisely. So the course is operating on these two levels. There's the normative level, which is the more traditional teaching of like leadership principles, sales techniques, marketing strategies, that kind of stuff.
Nuts and bolts.
Right. But then there's this other equally important level of reflective practice where they're encouraging the students to really examine their own assumptions and behaviors and to try to understand how those might be influencing their interactions with others, especially in diverse settings.
So it's about becoming aware of your own biases and blind spots.
Exactly. And ultimately, they want to go beyond just teaching the rules and move towards training these students to be able to transcend those unconscious norms through deliberate reflection. And they point out that this requires active, co-creative engagement from both the students and the lecturers. They mention Shapiro and Spalding as key thinkers in this area.
Okay, so it's this blend of theory and practice. They're not just talking about it, they're actually building it into the course design. Which brings us to those real-world examples, those vignettes that you mentioned earlier. I'm curious to see how this all plays out in practice. Let's start with the first one, HL team formation and the name game. What's this vignette all about?
So this one focuses on how they go about building collaborative teams right at the beginning of the course.
Okay, that's crucial, right? Setting the stage for effective teamwork.
Exactly. And they start by addressing some basic team psychology principles, recognizing that any project's success hinges on effective communication, having clear processes, and making sure everyone understands their role and responsibilities.
And the name game is the activity they use to get things rolling.
That's right. It's a really interesting icebreaker, often used in intercultural management training. Draws on the work of people like Hofstede. The students are asked to share the origin and meaning of their first names and talk about any experiences they've had where they felt uncomfortable or self-conscious about their name.
That's a pretty personal question right off the bat. What's the purpose of that?
Well, it has a surprisingly powerful impact. First, it just creates this atmosphere of curiosity and focused attention. Everyone's trying to learn each other's names and pronounce them correctly, which immediately establishes a more personal and respectful tone. And then by sharing these personal stories about their names, they're revealing a bit about their cultural backgrounds and their individual identities. So it's a way of acknowledging and celebrating that diversity right from the start.
I like it. Building that foundation of respect and understanding. And then what happens in terms of the team structure?
So after the name game, they move into defining the project team structure. The lecturers have already decided that there will be designated leaders within each student team, which they describe as primus prima inter pares, basically first among equals.
Okay, so a bit of structure provided up front.
Right. But then they give the students some agency in deciding how to divide up the work. They discuss and decide how to split the project into functional units, marketing, sales, finance, that kind of thing, and then they decide who's going to lead each of those units.
So a balance of structure and self-organization. How does the name game tie back into the larger learning objectives?
Well, the whole point is to raise their awareness of how their own personal backgrounds and experiences might shape their behavior within a team. They're starting to see the richness of those diverse experiences and develop a deeper understanding of each other, which hopefully will lead to stronger connections and more effective communication as they move through the project. And they actually bring in Belbin's model of team roles later in the course to help them further understand their strengths and how they contribute to a team.
So it's all very intentionally designed to set them up for success. All right, let's move on to the second vignette. DK communication challenges the approval process. This one sounds like it's about dealing with some real-world friction.
It is. This one highlights the importance of communication and having clear processes. The central issue here is that there's this established process for getting approval on all the marketing and promotional materials. Anna from the university and Ella from the charity have to sign off on everything.
Makes sense. Quality control and making sure everything's aligned.
Right. But it seems there was a bit of a hiccup involving Jonah, who was leading the student marketing team.
Oh, what happened?
So Jonah posted a video that his team had made in the WhatsApp group and asked for approval. Ella responded pretty positively, saying she liked the video, but she pointed out a problem with the accompanying text. She said she would have preferred to see the text beforehand and asked how hard it would be to change. Jonah's response was that it might be difficult given his team members' work schedule and the fact that he was abroad at the time, and couldn't really say when a revision would be possible.
Ooh, that's tricky. So Ella's trying to be helpful, but Jonah's feeling the pressure. What was the root of the miscommunication here?
Well, it seems like it was a difference in perspective. Anna, from the university, was concerned that the agreed-upon process wasn't being followed, while Jonah was more focused on the practical constraints his team was facing. Anna explained that the approval process was there to prevent errors and avoid multiple rounds of revisions later on, which is totally valid. But Jonah felt like having to get approval on the text before even making the video was kind of stifling his team's creativity.
So a clash between process and creative freedom. What did the author of the vignette learn from this experience?
Well, the author, who I'm assuming is Anna, realized that it's important to acknowledge and validate the students' challenges. They're juggling school, work, life, all of it. And she realized that sometimes just making space for them to explain their constraints can go a long way in resolving these kinds of procedural issues.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's not about letting things slide, but about understanding the context.
Right. And she also had a personal takeaway about the importance of her own work-life balance, especially during these intense project phases. Easy to get caught up in the urgency of it all.
Yeah, it's a good reminder for all of us, I think. Okay. Let's get to the last vignette, RM performance evaluation, the fishbowl discussion. This one's about how they handle assessing each other's contributions, right?
Yes. So they use this peer evaluation method where they give the students these adhesive dots that represent different values of coin.
Oh, interesting, like a symbolic currency. How does that work?
So on the day of the evaluation, the 25 students who were present were given a set number of red, blue, and green dots. Each color was worth a different amount. And then they had to distribute these dots among all 39 participants in the course, including themselves, based on their perception of each person's contribution to the project.
Okay, so they're literally putting a value on each other's contributions.
Yeah.
And then they had this fishbowl discussion. What is that exactly?
So, after all the dots were allocated, the 10 students who received the fewest points overall sat in an inner circle, and Theo, one of the lecturers, facilitated a 25-minute discussion with that group. The other students and the lecturers formed an outer circle and observed silently, taking notes on what was being said and how the dynamics were playing out. And then, after the inner circle had their discussion, the outer circle got to share their observations.
Wow, that's pretty intense. What kind of things came up in the inner circle discussion?
Well, Theo started by asking them why they thought they had received fewer points, and this led to a really honest, sometimes emotional conversation.
I bet. Having to confront that kind of feedback head on.
Yeah, definitely not easy. Some of the students felt like the group leaders were unfairly favored in the evaluations. Others pointed out that being a leader often meant taking on way more work and responsibility, and that maybe not everyone fully appreciated that.
That's a common dynamic, right? The unsung heroes working behind the scenes.
For sure. And then some felt like their contributions within their sub-teams weren't really visible to everyone, so they didn't get the recognition they deserved. There were concerns about students who were absent during the evaluation and how that might affect things. Some people talked about how workload was distributed differently across the different project groups, which could have influenced the point allocation. And then there was the fact that some students gave themselves points while others didn't, which some people saw as unfair.
So it really brought up all these different aspects of group dynamics and how we perceive and value each other's contributions.
It did. And then the outer circle had some interesting observations, too. One thing they noticed was that many of the students with the very lowest scores weren't even present at the discussion.
That says something right there, doesn't it? Maybe feeling disengaged or like they didn't want to face that feedback.
Yeah, potentially. And then they noticed that the students in the inner circle seemed to feel this pressure to justify their performance and explain why they got fewer points. Which makes sense, but it's still tough to be put on the spot like that. Some of the observers also expressed concern about whether those points would actually affect their grades, which added another layer of anxiety to the whole thing. And then the last thing they noticed was that overall, students who had taken on leadership roles tended to receive higher point totals.
Which you could interpret in a few different ways, right? Maybe the leaders were genuinely contributing more, or maybe people just naturally associate leadership with higher value.
Exactly. So many factors at play. What were the main learnings that the authors took away from this whole fishbowl experiment?
Yeah, what were the key insights?
Well, a couple of things. First, it really highlighted the fact that even though the students had self-organized into those initial project groups, there was still this underlying sense of unfairness about how those groups were formed.
Even though no one actually tried to change groups once they were set.
Right. It was this unspoken tension. And then it reinforced the idea that those leadership roles often come with a much heavier workload and more responsibility. And it also highlighted just how subjective peer evaluations are. You've got personal biases, group dynamics, communication styles, all these things influencing how people perceive and value each other. And then, of course, there was that issue of disengagement from those who received the low scores, which is a concern.
So many layers to unpack. All right, so we're nearing the end of our deep dive. As we wrap up, what are your biggest takeaways from this whole social interaction course?
Well, first of all, I just think it's incredibly innovative. The way they've woven together experiential learning, team building, and cross-cultural collaboration is really impressive. It's not just about knowledge transfer, it's about shaping how these students think and act in the world.
And the fact that they're doing all this with first-year students is pretty amazing.
I know, right? Setting them up with these skills right from the start. And that three-layer concept, the lectures, the project, the reflection, it's also carefully designed to work together to develop both practical competence and that deeper self-awareness that's so crucial for navigating complexity.
Yeah, it's not just about checking boxes. It's about cultivating a certain way of being in the world. And those vignettes, those real-world examples, were so valuable in showing how messy and unpredictable collaboration can be, even in a structured setting.
Totally. And the fishbowl discussion in particular just brought to life how complex assessment is, especially in group settings. So much subjectivity and so many potential pitfalls.
Absolutely. Ultimately, I think what this course demonstrates is that if we want to prepare people to deal with the challenges of the real world, we have to move beyond just teaching facts and theories. We have to create experiences where they can learn by doing, where they can make mistakes and learn from them, and where they have the space to reflect on those experiences in a meaningful way.
Couldn't agree more. And the paper actually ends with this thought-provoking statement. The biggest challenge for the lecturers is embracing the uncertainty of complex teaching settings and fully committing to the co-creation process, which I think speaks volumes about their commitment to this approach.
Yeah, it's about letting go of that need for control and trusting the process. Okay, so for our listeners out there who might not be university students but who are dealing with their own collaboration challenges and complex situations, what do you think are the biggest takeaways here?
Well, for me, the power of combining hands-on experience with structured reflection really stands out. And the fact that even in a well-designed environment, team dynamics can get messy and unpredictable. It's a good reminder to pay attention to those dynamics and to create space for open communication and feedback.
I agree. And one of the things that really stuck with me was this concept of embodied cognition. It makes you stop and think, what are some of those unconscious norms and biases that I'm bringing to my interactions?
Yeah, that's a great question to ponder. We all have them, whether we realize it or not.
So a big thank you to you, our listener, for sending us this fascinating paper. It's given us a lot to think about for sure.
Absolutely. Lots of food for thought.
Join us next time for another deep dive into the ideas that matter.